joining us on this panel discussion on the way forward after the second wave, organized by Ashoka University as a part of its Emphasis Lab for Machine Learning and Computational Thinking and its Distinguished Policy Speaker Series. My name is Akash Kumar. I'm the Assistant Manager for Emphasis Lab for Machine Learning and Computational Thinking at Ashoka. I'll be your host and guiding you through our discussion over the next 2 hours or so. The Distinguished Policy Speaker Series is a platform that brings together individuals from diverse spheres who share their learnings and experience with students, staff, and faculty members. To begin this event, I would like to invite Professor Malabika Sarkar to address the virtual gathering. Professor Sarkar is the Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University and a former Vice Chancellor of Presidency University, Kolkata. She was the first Dean of Faculty and Research at Ashoka and was until recently the Principal Academic Advisor before becoming the Vice Chancellor. Professor Sarkar, please.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here at another event of the Ashoka Distinguished Policy Speaker Series. The way forward after the second wave, this panel discussion is a very, very promising one and a very important one. And looking at the title of today's panel discussion, I was thinking to myself how important language has become since the pandemic. Now that we are all in the virtual mode, the verbal has become so very important. The pandemic, of course, has thrown up a new glossary altogether. Words like unprecedented, new normal, find their way into almost every email. But today's title, The Second Wave. Well, the second wave, of course, makes all of us think of a tsunami, that this pandemic is actually inexorable. There are repeated onslaughts. It keeps hitting us. And we don't know what will happen beyond the second wave. We will know a little more once the panel discussion is over. But while that is so, the panel discussion title also says the way forward. And that indeed is critical because there is so much that has happened to turn the world upside down because of the pandemic. And in the process, some unexpected things have happened, that there have been groups that were erstwhile faceless, migrant workers, health workers, etc. Their conditions have now become the concern of all of us. So there are many, many aspects of both the disease and its ramifications and social, economic, and various other aspects to be considered as we go forward. We have this morning a great set of speakers for the panel discussion. I'm sure that the entire discussion, both the presentations and the conversations thereafter, will be very, very productive. And I'm sure that this panel discussion will show the way towards a brave new world. Not the dystopian vision of Huxley, but the original Shakespearean Tempest and Miranda saying, oh brave new world that has such people in it. Because it's the people, the panelists and others all around us in the world who are going to make the change, who are going to make the world livable, even after the pandemic. So it's a great initiative to have a panel discussion on the way forward after the second wave. We all look forward to the presentations and the discussions, and I'm sure it's going to be a great morning for everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to these discussions.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarkar, for that welcome address. As I mentioned earlier, our theme for this discussion is the way forward after the second wave. It is a topic that needs to be addressed now, as the WHO said that we are in a very dangerous period of the pandemic. The lethal Delta variant is out there, and in countries around the world, lockdowns have emerged across continents. Looking forward, it is essential that we take a reconnaissance of our state at hand and anticipate what might unfold in the coming weeks. This leads us to discuss lessons to avoid the mishaps in the future. To discuss all of this, We have a very diverse panel of experts from Ashoka University, all distinguished and established. I would like to very quickly introduce them to you, beginning with Professor Shahid Jamil, who is a virologist and an academic. Currently heading the Trivedi School of Biosciences at Ashoka University, he was earlier the CEO of Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance. Professor Jamil is known for his research on the hepatitis E virus and has been awarded the Shanti Sharu Bhatnagar Prize for Science and Technology, one of the highest science awards for his contributions to medical sciences. The Trivedi Center, which he heads, focuses on advancing research in synthetic biology, infectious diseases, chronic diseases, and other emerging areas of biosciences and nurturing world-class talent. Welcome, Professor Jamil, to our panel. We now move to Professor Ashwini Deshpande, who's a professor of economics and the founding director of Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. She has been working on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action with a focus on caste and gender in India. She has published extensively in leading scholarly journals. She is the author of Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India, Oxford University Press, New Delhi, and Affirmative Action in India, Oxford University Press, New Delhi, and Oxford India Short Introduction Series 2013. She is the editor of several volumes. She has received the EXIM Bank Award for Outstanding Dissertation, now called the IARA Award, in 1994, and the 2007 V.K.R.V. Rao Award for Indian Economists Under 45. Welcome, Professor Deshpande. I would now Bhavaskar, who will join us in a while. Professor Amita Bhavaskar is a professor of environmental studies and sociology and anthropology. Her research and teaching addresses the cultural politics of environment and development in rural and urban India. She focuses on the role of social inequality and identities in natural resource conflicts. She was awarded the 2005 Malcolm Adishesh Award for Distinguished Contributions to Development Studies, the 2008 V.K.R.V. Rao Prize for Social Science and Research, and the 2010 Infosys Prize for Social Sciences. We now move to Professor Gautam Menon, who is the director of 3CS, Center for Climate Change and Sustainability at Ashoka University. He is also a professor of physics and biology at Ashoka, professor with the theoretical physics and computational biology groups at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai, and the adjunct professor at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. The modeling of infectious disease and its implications for public policy is a long-standing interest of his. And his group provides modeling inputs for COVID-19 to a number of local governments and states. Welcome, Professor Menon. And lastly, we have Professor Meghna Krishnamurthy, who's an associate professor of sociology and social anthropology at Ashoka University. She is trained at Harvard University, University of Cambridge, and University College London, where she completed her physics and anthropology as a UCL Global Excellence Scholar. Over the last 15 years, her research, publications, policy, and professional engagements have involved work within and across a range of field sites and subjects, enabling her to serve in various roles at the intersection of and in partnerships with academia, public policy, government, the private sector, and grassroots civil society. She is also a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, where she leads a major interdisciplinary and multi-sectoral research and practice initiative on state capacity. Welcome, Professor Krishnamurthy. Now, the format we follow for this 2-hour webinar is simple. We will hear from our team of panelists first. Post their presentations, the panelists will discuss the issues by asking each other questions. After that, we open the floor to questions from the audience. We are on Zoom and YouTube. You're welcome to post your questions in the chat box, and we will try to accommodate as many as possible within our time frame. Without much ado, let me begin by inviting Professor Jamil. Sir, please.
Thank you very much, Atash. And, it's a pleasure to be on the panel with such distinguished colleagues. Let me get started by sharing my screen. All right, so I will be talking about these waves, so to say, and the viral variants and vaccines and explore what sort of variants have emerged and what is the effect of those variants on the vaccines. So just to give you a little update on where we are in India at this time, while most people think that the pandemic in India is over, at least this wave is over, that's not the case. Although the graph has come down for daily cases, we are still pulling roughly 40,000 cases a day. And while the incidence of infection is much less in the northern and central part of India, the west, south, and especially the northeast are still pulling in a lot of infection. So by no means it is over. The other thing that you notice is that while the active cases took a dip, they are on the rise again. And this should be of concern to us as the country opens up after the second wave. Infections are increasing, at least the active infections are increasing. What is also important is that the vaccination rates are slowly going up, and that's important in allowing us to mitigate the next waves. And finally, the test positivity rate, which is an indicator of how much infection is there in the population, right now hovers around 2%, although the WHO says it should be below 5%. But I think we need to raise the bar and take it at least below 1% to be able to say that we have truly controlled this wave. All right, so let me walk you through this graph here in time. So this is from the beginning when the virus came into India till now. What have we seen during this time? The first thing we saw during this time was the national lockdown. And the national lockdown happened at a time when India had only 650 cases and 12 deaths. So we went into one of the earliest lockdowns, and we were possibly one of the few countries, if not the only country, that had to open a lockdown when the cases were still rising. But what that did was to sort of flatten the first wave, gave us time to prepare capacity. And thankfully, the second wave, although it pulled about 100,000 cases per day at peak, did not cause the kind of devastation that we saw in the second wave over here. Now, by this time, by January, February of this year, we thought everything was over for us. For 5 months, the curve was on a down trend. And there were lots of weddings, there were other functions, parties. What happened around that time as well is that the government went on with elections, state elections, local body elections, and of course the Kumbh Mela. And notice all of this was happening when the second wave was on the rise. But what led to this rise? What led to the rise was the emergence of a variant that was first seen towards the end of December. It mutated further into sublineages, and that became the Delta variant, which was highly infectious. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that three things came together. We were complacent, there were super spreader events, and at the same time, there were infectious variants that had emerged. And that led to this enormous peak, which was pulling roughly 400,000, 4 lakh cases per day at peak. Since around mid-May, this is on the downward trend, and I'm sure Gautam is going to say much about it. What we also saw during this time is the fraction of this particular variant, the Delta variant, in the population kept increasing. From early March till May, you will see that the Delta variant became the dominant variant circulating in the population. So again, I will say that three things came together which caused all the misery that we saw in April and May. And of course, vaccination rates were still low because vaccination started only around mid-January. There was a lot of hesitancy initially. And that contributed to the second wave. So the second wave essentially was due to complacency of individuals, of governments, and policy mechanisms. We had super spreader events, as I've just explained, and there were more infectious variants. The Alpha variant also came into India around January, and wherever the Alpha and Delta variants were together in the same population, Delta outcompeted the Alpha, which shows you how much more infectious the Delta variant was. And finally, we had insufficient vaccine coverage. Only about 4.2 million doses had been given by February end, which comprised only 0.3% of India's population got one dose. Now, if you start comparing the infectiousness of the variants, if the red dot here is the infectiousness of the original virus, and let's say that is 1, the Alpha variant that came into India in January had about 50% more infectiousness. But look at where the Delta variant is. It's roughly 2.5 times more infectious than the original virus. And this really catalyzed everything in the second wave that we saw. Now, the virus enters a cell by binding to certain proteins on the surface of cells, which are called receptors, and you would have heard this term called ACE2 receptor. Now, here are some structural maps of the human ACE2 receptor shown here and the viral spike protein shown here. The only thing I want to show you is that mutations in the Alpha variant and in the Beta variant were at the interface of where the virus binds to the cell. And it is also these spots that are targets for antibodies that neutralize binding of the virus to the cell surface. And when you come to the Delta variant, more mutations started happening in those regions. There were mutations that happened away from that region as well. Altogether, this gave us a highly infectious variant virus. Now, if we map all these mutations on the surface of the virus, and if you concentrate on this figure in the middle over here, that is looking at the virus from the top down. And you see the spike protein and you see the binding surface of the spike protein. You see the binding surface of the spike protein where it binds to the cell. And almost all the key mutations that are present in any of these variants of concern are located in that particular region. And if that was not enough, we now have something called Delta Plus, which essentially is the same as the Delta variant over here, but it brings in another mutation from the Beta variant first found in South Africa. So the coming together of two variant lineages is the cause of some concern at this point. All right. So here's some data from laboratory studies, and I'm not going to go into explaining the details, just to show you that if you took the sera of people who got infected early in the pandemic and tried to challenge these viruses in the lab, you will see that the sera reduced the neutralization. Sera was still able to neutralize those viruses, but with little reduced efficacy. People who were infected by the Alpha variant, again, neutralized all other viruses, but with reduced efficacy. People who were infected with the South African variant or the Beta variant did the same. And people who were infected by the Gamma or the Brazilian variant also did the same. So the point really is that while there is a reduced neutralization of viruses in the lab, there is no widespread escape of these variants of concern from antibodies that we generate when we get infected. And here is another neutralization study, lab neutralization study, and I'll focus your attention to the Alpha, Delta, and Beta variants. The point is that the Alpha variant is reduced very effectively. The Delta variant is neutralized not as well, but still sufficiently. And the beta variant is really the worst of all in terms of neutralization in a laboratory. Now, these are laboratory studies. What about real world data? So to begin with, here is some real world data that came out a few days back based on studies in Canada. So they're comparing 3 vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, and the AstraZeneca vaccine. Compare them to the original virus, which is not the variant of concern, and the different variants of concern. They're looking at symptomatic infection, and they're also looking at hospitalization or death. So just to be very simple about this, the point is that whichever vaccine you take, you're still able to neutralize the virus very well in the real world, giving you close to 100% protection from these variants, from both symptomatic infection as well as hospitalization, irrespective of the vaccine that you have taken. Coming to studies from 4 different studies from UK, which looked at 2 different vaccines, Pfizer and AstraZeneca, against the Delta variant. And again, the same thing. Both vaccines prevent hospitalization, severe disease and hospitalization in the real world quite well. And that is against the Delta variant, which is rising in the UK. And finally, 2 studies from India. And these studies are not distinguished based on which vaccine was used. Since 90% of India got Covishield, we assume that most of the effect here is because of Covishield. So the CMC Velour study, I want you to look at the numbers for whether infection was there, hospitalization, severe disease, and ICU care. And you see that even 1 dose protects very well, especially from severe disease, and 2 doses protect much better. And finally, Tamil Nadu Police Department released this study in their personnel. And you see that people who got no vaccine, if their relative risk of dying from COVID was 1, those who got both doses of vaccine, they had a 20-fold less risk of dying from COVID. So the point of all of this is, no matter what anyone says, the data shows that vaccines in the real world are working, and they're also working against currently available variants. Now, the question is often asked, will there be a 3rd wave? When will there be a 3rd wave? How big will it be? Well, I've put some graphs here for the top 10 countries. And the thing that becomes immediately apparent is that different countries behave differently in terms of the rise and fall of infection, those so-called waves. And that's India that you have seen. So really, a lot will depend upon local conditions, our behaviors, our vaccination rates, all of that. So to summarize, whether a 3rd wave will be there or will not be there, when will it be, how big will it be, it will depend upon individual behavior. Will we continue to use masks and avoid crowds as the country is opening up? What is going to be the vaccine coverage? As of yesterday, about 26% of Indians got 1 dose. And this number really needs to go up in the range of about 60 to 70% for us to be able to see the effects. And whether more infectious variants emerge, just like Delta emerged and outcompeted Alpha, will there be another variant which will outcompete Delta? We don't know that. Delta plus is certainly not that. It's becoming quite clear now. But whether an Omega will develop later, who knows? But the point is that if we follow the first one and the second one, we can avoid the 3rd one. Because the more the virus transmits, the more it replicates, multiplies in the population, there are higher chances of newer variants. So let's focus on individual behavior. Let's focus on getting vaccinated, and hopefully we can mitigate the 3rd wave. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Professor Jamil, for walking us through your presentation. With various interesting studies that you have shown, it reaffirms the importance of taking the vaccine as a major way to stop the human transmission of the virus. I would now like to invite Professor Ashwini Deshpande to her presentation.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me on this very distinguished panel. I am Ashwini Deshpande. I'm a professor of economics at Ashoka University and the director of a new center that has been set up at Ashoka called the Center of Economic Data and Analysis. So I actually, after this really brilliant presentation by Professor Jamil, I feel a little hesitant and nervous because I don't have a very well made presentation, but I'm going to use the 10 minutes at my disposal to flag a set of questions that are related to socio-economic outcomes. So we heard all about the spread of the disease, the different variants, vaccinations, etc., the risk of COVID itself. But what has COVID done to our lives as economic agents, as social individuals in the economy? And I'm going to talk about some of the evidence from the first wave, because the second wave is still underway, and we have some evidence from the second wave itself also, as a way of preparing ourselves against the possible third wave if we learn appropriate lessons from what the Indian economy experienced in the first wave. So one of my areas of interest has been the labor market or employment, and I've been working a lot on employment, particularly the gender gap in employment, women's employment and labor force participation. And as those who are familiar with these issues for India already know, the gender gaps in the labor market in India have been present for a while now. So women's recorded labor force participation rate has been declining for the last 2 decades. Now, what the reasons for that are, etc., we can go into that during the Q&A. I have done some work on that as well. But what did we see as a result of the first wave of COVID-19 in India? So the already low recorded labor force participation rate of women fell even more during COVID. So the gender gap in labor force participation rate and employment worsened during the first wave of COVID-19. This is in the context of an overall fall in employment because, as Professor Jamil was showing us, even before COVID hit with its full ferocity, India imposed a very strict national lockdown with virtually no warning. So overnight, literally, economic establishments were shut down, other than some essential services. And what that meant for India's labor force, a large, overwhelming part of which is informal. About 90% of India's workforce is in the informal sector, which means that they don't have tenured or permanent jobs. So people who sell, their wares on the street, daily wagers, casual laborers, etc., overnight were out of work. And because these establishments are informal, there was no certainty about whether they will reopen and whether the same people who had suddenly were out of work would be employed again. And what we saw as a result of that uncertainty was this very tragic exodus of migrants heading from urban areas back to their rural villages because there was no guarantee of a job. There was no place to live, there was no money, there was no access to food. And so the only possible way to survive was to head back to rural India, where also work was not forthcoming, but at least there was some guarantee, possible guarantee of food just by virtue of being with their families and also by accessing the rural employment guarantee work, which is at minimum wage. So employment was a huge crisis that emerged with ferocity during the first national lockdown. And within that, what we saw was an reinforcement of the gender gap in labor force participation rates. Now, in September, October, November, as the economy unlocked gradually, there was some resurgence of economic activity. And the belief was that that will then start to again close the gender gaps. Unfortunately, that did not happen, because one of the things that happened for women was that in the very strict national lockdown, when literally everything was shut, Indian families, particularly middle class families whose work runs on the back of domestic help, what families were grappling with was the absence of any help for domestic chores. And so when I first looked at the data on domestic work, in May 2020, there was a slight sliver of hope, because men's time spent on domestic work actually went up relative to the pre pandemic period. Now, I'm sure that you're aware that South Asia in general, and India and Pakistan in particular, have among the worst, the most unequal ratios of time spent on domestic work. So women do about 10 times more domestic work than men do. And in May 2020, this gap had come down slightly, which was a very small silver lining on a very dark cloud. But I've been tracking this data, and unfortunately, as the economy has unlocked, this gap in domestic chores has worsened. So now the gender gap in domestic chores is now worse than even the pre-pandemic period. So men have not only reduced their time spent on domestic work, they have actually gone down below the time that they spent, which was already low pre-pandemic, and women's time on domestic work has worsened. And my research, as well as research of other people, shows that one of the chief constraints that prevents women from accessing paid work employment opportunities is the predominant responsibility of getting domestic chores done, whether they do it themselves or they have to get it done. And so, in that sense, this has worsened an already very tight constraint that was preventing Indian women from accessing paid work when work was available. Remember that, uh, and I'll come to this point a little bit later, that employment has been in crisis for from before pandemic, from before COVID-19. So availability of decent work has been an issue, or rather non-availability of decent work has been an issue with India uh, predating the pandemic. And so on an already existing employment crisis came COVID. On an already low women's labor force participation rate came COVID and made this worse. Right now, we have to note, however, that in many countries, particularly the data from the United States is pretty telling in this context, which is that women who already had paid jobs and who were not going to be laid off, but because of the pressures of combining work from home and children's homeschooling, because schools and daycare centers have been closed for a very long time. They've just started to open up again in the United States. Many women dropped out of paid work because they found it impossible to combine the multiple demands of domestic chores, homeschooling, taking care of children, and taking care of their own paid work responsibilities. Remember that the gender division of household chores is much more equal in the United States than it is in India. However, even in the United States, the responsibility of childcare and the responsibility of homeschooling, the responsibility of just care work in general, is predominantly the the mothers, the women's. And so this hit women really badly, and women dropped out of paid work. And in India, we see a similar trend for urban women who are lucky enough to have a job and are lucky enough to be able to work from home. But there was this issue. I'm going through all of these very serious issues as sort of bullet points because there's a lot to say and I just have 10 minutes. The other sort of gender dimension, which is very important, that we must be mindful of during COVID-19, is what the UN has described as the shadow pandemic. Everywhere, the chief strategy of nations to deal with the first wave especially was the imposition of national lockdowns everywhere in the world. As a result of which women and children were locked in indoors with their abusers. And, while when we talk of violence against women, a lot of public attention is on public safety, and that's an important component, there's no doubt. But the largest amount of violence against women and children is perpetrated by those known to them: fathers, uncles, brothers, friends, etc., etc. And so, while the attention on public safety detracts from this point. And so what has happened all over the world, and India is no exception, is that wherever the pandemic has followed, the shadow pandemic has followed. And as a result of the lockdowns, women's ability to access shelters, care centers, helplines has been severely diminished. And this has taken a huge toll on the physical and mental health of women because of the shadow pandemic of domestic abuse. So that's an important consequence or accompaniment of the pandemic that we need to be aware of. Now, Professor Jamil just highlighted very succinctly why vaccinations at the end of the day are our safest protection against COVID-19. But the way in which the government of India has gone about the vaccination programs, and there are many issues related to that, and I'm not going to be able to highlight all of them. But one of the critical constraints that Indians have faced to access the not adequate vaccine supplies is the digital divide, because access to vaccination is based on a smartphone app, which until recently was only in English. Now, while mobile penetration in India is pretty decent, access to smartphones is not. A. Second, even if there is a smartphone in the family, it's typically held by the man, not by the woman. And so our work in CEDA has shown how women have been at the back of the digital divide, at the back of the vaccination queue. And this is a trend that we see overall in access to healthcare, which is that women's healthcare seems to be often a secondary concern. Now, you might ask, okay, why do we always have to talk about gender? Surely everybody needs to get vaccinated. And why is gender suddenly an issue here? Absolutely. Everybody needs to get vaccinated, and there is no reason to insert gender where it's not warranted. But if we are not mindful of constraints that women face in accessing healthcare, we might end up creating a gender divide, as seems to be happening right now, when there is really no need for a gender divide, which is everybody should be getting vaccinated. So, unless we are mindful of the gender divide, we are not going to be able to take steps to correct it. Now, this gender divide has worsened with time because in the first lot of people who got vaccinated were the healthcare workers, who are predominantly women. As the proportion of healthcare workers is going down and the average citizens is going up in those who are receiving vaccinations, the gender gap has started to arise. And so the same structural factors that prevent women from accessing healthcare services are showing up in vaccinations, and we must be mindful of that. And that brings me to my next point, which is, as a result of COVID-19, other health concerns are getting neglected. Children are missing their vaccines. Children, of course, are missing schools, as we know, because schools are closed for a prolonged period of time. And the digital divide that marks the rural-urban, caste divides, a socio-economic strata, etc. All of those have an impact on schooling. So only those who are lucky enough to have devices, connectivity, space, privacy, those are the only kids who are going to be able to continue homeschooling, in this sort of heavily disrupted time. Women's access to healthcare, their access to contraception, ability to go and procure contraception, all of these are severely impacted. There's a lot of research that has shown that. And finally, CEDA, the center that I talked about earlier, has now done a series of articles, and I don't have time to summarize all of those, with focusing on incomes, expenditures, intention to save, employment by sector, for example, manufacturing, services, etc., etc. And what we find here in all of these analyses is that the crisis really started about 7 to 8 years ago. The first big breach in all of these, sort of decline in all of these aggregates happened with demonetization. And while the economy was barely recovering from demonetization, came the imposition of the GST regime. So before COVID hit, the Indian economy was hit by two massive shocks. Also, especially demonetization, also just similarly announced overnight. And for the Indian economy, which is predominantly informal workers, um, both these shocks hit really hard. And the COVID-19 pandemic, with the first national lockdown, has hit it even harder. Now, you might say, okay, COVID was not under the control of any government. What should be done? Well, again, at CEDA, as well as many other think tanks, many other scholars have pointed out that given the uncertainty associated with COVID, given that we don't know when it's going to end, newer variants are continuously emerging, economic crises, lockdowns might have to come and go. We need a concerted, national, centrally sponsored safety net welfare scheme consisting of cash transfers, in-kind transfers to protect workers from the vagaries that COVID-19 is going to continue to impose. India consists of a very large number of very small employers. These employers, small and medium enterprises, they don't have the reserves to keep workers on their payroll when their factories are shut or when their establishments are shut. So these establishments need payroll support. Unfortunately, the thrust of the economic policies has been to provide lending, loans, whereas that's not what is needed. Liquidity is not what is needed. What is needed is infusion of cash, a fiscal stimulus, a very strong fiscal stimulus of the kind that, for example, America is seeing now. That is the only way in which individuals will have some purchasing power that will weather them against these repeated shocks. Small and medium enterprises will have payroll support where they can keep employees on their payroll and migrants don't have to go back. Rural and urban employment guarantee, and access to healthcare and food, most of all, and shelter during these times. So all of this needs a massive infusion of cash support, and we had calculated it comes to about 20,000 crores as a fiscal stimulus. Is it worth it? Is it affordable? Absolutely. Because the absence of this is going to unleash an economic crisis that's going to cost the Indian economy very dearly. So we absolutely have the ability, and we must have the willingness to infuse this, to infuse the economy with this with this scale of fiscal support. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Deshpande, for walking us through that interesting research and guiding us about the gender dimensions of the pandemic, which rarely make it to the mainstream. Indeed, a fiscal stimulus is something that's much needed to give their economy a reboot. Thank you very much again. And I now invite Professor Amita Bhavishkar for her presentation. Ma'am, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. My comments are primarily going to be based on my research as a sociologist, anthropologist of the environment, someone who looks at questions of ecological as much as social justice. In a way, this panel asks us to think about the way forward, and that in some ways assumes that we're able to not only observe and analyze the trends of the present, but also think of effective ways of being able to translate our findings into some kind of action. And that's where I think we run into a great deal of resistance, because there are very, very strong pressures to return to so-called normal, to return to business as usual, as life was before the pandemic. And much though we may crave many of the things that we enjoyed so effortlessly before the pandemic, things that we took for granted, our mobility, our ability to consume in particular kinds of ways, the pandemic has told us that some of these ways of being are simply impractical and seriously responsible for the kinds of problems that might emerge in the future. So in a way, the pandemic is a warning that we need to change the ways in which we live, the ways in which we think. Whether we can heed that warning is a big question. And given all the kinds of powerful interests that are invested in trying to keep life going as it was, I think it's going to be very hard to bring about course correction on the scale that we need. But what exactly is this course correction that I'm talking about? Well, one, I think that the pandemic, the fact that it emerged from a wild species, shows that the kind of interaction that human beings have with areas of wilderness, with other species, has become more and more problematic. Whether we think about bats or we think about and from creatures from the wild that are hunted, or we think about the massive scale on which we do what is basically factory farming, be it of poultry, be it of pigs, other creatures. These are increasingly modes of production that bring us into contact with other species, with viruses that may have had only localized impacts, but because of globalization, because of our increased mobility, now, of course, respect no barriers. This is what the writer David Quammen calls spillover, the way in which the destruction of habitats of wilderness around the world has resulted in growing interaction between viruses with their amazing capacity to mutate and humans who are vulnerable, who have no immunity to them, and that constant race to catch up with a nature that we certainly do not control. The big lesson from that particular, from not just this particular event of the coronavirus, COVID-19, but also with other coronaviruses, with Ebola, with others, is that we need to be much more mindful of the limits of our ability to know nature, to control nature. And that must mean that we have to respect the limits of nature. Is that likely to happen once the pandemic is over? I think the chances of being able to bring about a drastic change in our relationship with nature, especially the aspect of habitat destruction, are actually pretty slender. If we look at the situation before the pandemic hit, what we've seen is, since the 1990s, but increasingly in the last 10 years, is the acceleration of resource depletion. I'm sorry, my slides are in a little bit of what we've seen is, this is a picture from the Narmada Valley, and these are memorial stones to ancestors, which have under a mahua tree, a tree that is regarded as sacred among Adivasis in the area. And this particular land is close to the submergence zone of the Sardar Sarovar Dam, an area which is hilly, forested, and which has been lost forever. Now, these kinds of projects have only accelerated in the last 15, 20 years. And we've seen that the process of making what are the commons that sustain millions of poor working class people across the country, namely land, water, wetlands, marine and coastal areas, forests, all of these have been have been made accessible and pretty much handed over to large corporate businesses. So not only has this been a process that has been profoundly unjust, it's also a process which has resulted in severe environmental degradation. We've been virtually cutting the ground away from our feet, which is not only something which causes an injustice between poor people, rich people, people in the countryside, people in the city, but is also something which uh, in terms of justice between species, in terms of justice between our generation and the generations yet to come, is something which is profoundly inequitable. And we've seen that the pandemic and the subsequent economic downturn that Professor Deshpande talked about has been used and will be used in the coming years to actually justify further acceleration of economic exploitation of natural resources. So this is something to be extremely careful about, that one needs to make sure that there is a safe space which is which we regard as sacrosanct from the point of view of poor people's access to the commons, from the point of view of protecting these global commons from exploitation. And this is the point which is very, very hard for people to understand, because it means that we have to also think seriously about our own consumption practices. The cell phones that we use, they require metals, so therefore precious metals. The Democratic Republic of Congo, which has amazing primary forests, has been deforested in order to mine coltan. It's a habitat for the silverback gorillas, but the gorillas don't matter as long as we can have our smartphones. So there's a way also in which our global travel, our ability to use fossil fuels is also responsible for other kinds of grave environmental damage in the form of global warming. But there again, the cause of bringing back the economy means that the newspapers report about increased air travel as if it is something to celebrate. So there is a serious rethinking that needs to happen about that connection between economy and ecology if we are to avoid pandemics of the sort that we have seen, if we are to avoid the kind of havoc that has been created by not just this particular COVID-19 virus, but also other kinds of diseases and other kinds of what are essentially ecological catastrophes coming together with extremely fragile social and economic systems. I'm going to talk very briefly about two sets of things as a sociologist that I think relate to these ecological questions. And they relate to the ecological questions by the fact that the kind of enclosure of the commons, the privatization of our natural resources that we've seen, is something which has led to the impoverishment of vast numbers of people who then form the sort of urban migrant working class that needs to maintain 1 foot in the countryside, in the village, 1 foot in the city, neither of which place can actually sustain them. To think that migrant workers didn't have a cushion of savings that would allow them to live for 2 or 3 weeks longer in their place of work tells us just exactly how elusive the idea of economic growth, the idea of jobs that sustain people actually is. And when we think of villages, we know that while they provide people with the social networks that they need in order to survive and live as human beings, as people with dignity, they're certainly insufficient in terms of being able to provide them with the material means of survival, with jobs, with capital, with the ability to make a better life for their children. So the pandemic and the lockdown and the responses to it have shown us that there is immense generosity among people. And that generosity takes the form of both civic organizations, NGOs, as well as individuals going out and donating food, giving people bundles of provisions, people going out of their way in order to set up oxygen langars so that they can help those who are in distress, those who have less than them. But we have to remember that charity and philanthropy are no substitute for the kinds of entitlements that people should have by virtue of being citizens. And these entitlements include the right to basic health care, the right to basic education, the right to income, the right to social security in case you can't earn for yourself. And what the lockdown and pandemic have shown us is that none of these kinds of safety devices actually exist for the vast majority of Indians, those who've suffered the dispossession and gradual marginalization from the countryside. I think what the social response to the pandemic shows is, of course, great generosity. The response of civil society shows that people actually do have some empathy and care for others in distress, but we must also recognize the limits of this. Charity is something that maintains the status quo. It helps people in times of extreme distress. It doesn't lift them out of that distress and make them self-sufficient. And for a number of working class people who lost their livelihoods at this time, what was most remarkable was not only that they lost their ability to buy food, but that they lost their dignity. A number of people said, "Izzat chali gayi." And we must remember that people are social beings for whom dignity, izzat, the sense of identity that you are a person of honor, is as important as being able to have food in your stomach. And if there's in the way forward, what I think we need to think about is how this great frustration that people felt at being basically at the mercy of benevolent souls is something which actually can be brought together collectively in order to make sure that people can mobilize in order for greater economic and social justice. These efforts have always been underway, but the fight, for instance, for basic income for people, basic resources so that they can be self-sufficient, whether financial resources, whether land-based resources. The notion that people should not be dependent on others for charity, and that perhaps they should also not be dependent on the state for handouts, but should be able to support themselves and be independent, is something that needs to go forward. Finally, I want to talk about the fact that the pandemic as well as the lockdown have resulted in great grief and great anxiety, traumatic anxiety for very large numbers of people. And perhaps we will never quite come to terms with this grief, but we know from what psychiatrists and other healthcare workers are telling us is that the burden of emotional trauma in India and elsewhere is huge. And we just don't have the capacity to even acknowledge it, let alone address it. But I think what we have also learned is that it's not only that the pandemic has brought great uncertainty, an uncertainty where elites who, we thought we were masters of our destiny, we were making plans for what we would do 1 year, 2 years ahead. We took for granted that we would be able to, travel around the world. Those kinds of plans have suddenly come crashing down. The kind of uncertainty created by the pandemic is actually part of a series of other uncertainties created by climate change. It's extreme events, it's uncertain, rainfall, heat waves, and floods, and so on. Of course, events which have been exacerbated by bad human planning. But dealing with uncertainty is going to call for much larger reservoirs of emotional and psychic resources, which elites by and large don't have, because elites are used to being in control. What does it mean to live always with uncertainty? And there, I think there are lessons that we can learn from poorer people, for people who live not knowing what they will earn the next day, whether their children will go hungry or not. people who learn to stoically cope with death in their families, the deaths of children from trivial things, diarrhea, snake bite, and so on. These are not things that one wishes upon other people, but the lesson that one can learn, even as one tries to make life more secure for others, is that a lot of people learn to live with uncertainty and do so with resilience. So, how can we develop resilience as a society? It requires that, first of all, we acknowledge that we have squeezed out natural resources to an extent where they've lost their flexibility. A lot of our ecological habitats can't spring back anymore. So we need to work on restoration. We need to work on the restoration of livelihoods. But finally, we need to also recognize that we need great resilience, ecological, social, as well as psychic and emotional, in order to be able to survive not just the pandemic, but also all the other uncertain extreme events we're going to be dealing with in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bhavishkar, for walking us through your presentation and those starking pictures. Those were horrific and what not to say at the very first instance. And very interesting that you brought up the aspects such as society and what we should not take with tremendous sense of entitlement as citizens. Thank you so much again. And I now invite Professor Gautam Menon for his presentation. Sir, please.
Thank you, Akash. And this is a very special panel discussion because I don't think I've been on a panel discussion that covered such a large scope of all the way from economics to the immune system and vaccines, right up to modeling, to anthropology. Okay, so Professor Jamil had shown you this picture earlier. This is what happened in India between the 30th of January, 2020, when the Indian pandemic started with the first case, to what is to right up to the current day. And you can see the sort of gentler first wave, which peaked at about 98,000 cases around the 15th of September of last year. And the second peak, which is in excess of 400, around 410,000 cases on a particular day. And that happened about a month and a half ago. And after that, it's been a steady decline right now. And we're currently recording around 40,000 cases per day. It seems to have flattened out a little bit. That may be a point of concern in the days going forward. But let's just look at this and then try and understand this from the point of view of what's been unfolding in other parts of the world. And again, Professor Jamil showed you a picture like this. This is the UK, the US, Russia, etc. And you can see the sort of ups and downs, etc. These are called waves, and people refer to these as the second wave and the third wave, but there really is no definition of a wave. All of that exists is really the sort of thing that looks like a wavy little piece. But then, if you look at the US data, you will see that it never really goes down all the way down to low numbers. It sort of goes up, comes down a bit, then goes up again, comes down a bit, goes up again. So are these really supposed to be the classic waves in which you would have cases essentially dropping to a number very, very small, 10 to 100 per day, and then going up? Not clear in that particular piece of data. In South Africa, in Russia, again, the South African numbers are probably the closest to what look like waves. But here again, there are questions about, are you recording all the cases correctly? If you were, would these figures, would these little pictures look different? That depends upon the number of tests that you're able to do. All of these have to be factored into the understanding of pictures like this. What's going to happen in the future? What determines what might happen? And this is a question that is best approached from the point of view of models, because models can give you some idea of what happens if you put all of this information in at different points. What goes into the models is the following. How many people have been infected already and therefore will have some level of protection against the disease in the future? It may not be perfect protection, but there will still be some level of protection we can anticipate. What is the probability of a reinfection? Okay, you've been infected once. You're not perfectly protected against another infection, particularly if there is a new variant that comes along. But how likely is it that you might have symptoms if you're infected again. So what's the probability of a reinfection? That's another number that should go in. How many have been vaccinated already? We know that vaccines do provide substantial protection against symptomatic disease, against severe disease, and certainly against death. So how many people have been vaccinated will determine the nature of that curve as it goes on in the future. If you've been infected but are not showing symptoms, you may typically not go in for a test, and therefore you will not register in that curve of cases every day. But again, vaccines aren't perfect. So how likely are vaccine breakthroughs? Can you say that 20% of people who've been with a prior vaccination and 2 weeks after the second dose of vaccination are likely to be infected again? Well, should that number be 10%? Should it be 20%? What should it be? The main questions about what might happen in the future really, so all of the first four are biological, medical, clinical questions. But the hardest thing to put into models is what people will do. Will people continue to wear masks? How do governments signal to people what is appropriate behavior? And how do governments, in fact, enforce, if at all, a certain type of behavior going forward in the future? Let's say the next 3 months to 6 months as these numbers evolve. This is also, at some level, people may themselves choose to not expose themselves, to work from home as far as possible rather than go back to office, to not go to malls and theaters, etc., if they suspect that they might be in danger. So apart from that, we can come back to the biological questions of could something new happen that we've not anticipated earlier? All of 1, 2, 3, and 4, we can understand these from numbers that we have already, and we're getting a better and better idea of these numbers. But suppose something completely new came along. For example, as Professor Jamil said, the rise in cases of the second wave was really driven by new variants, the new Delta variant and the Alpha variant from the UK and the north of India, the Delta variant in the west of India. And could this happen again? Could something new, a Delta plus or something worse that we haven't even thought about currently? Could it happen that this comes along, this is more transmissible, and then drives out the other variants that exist in the population? Seasonality, we're just entering the monsoon season now. After that, there will be a period in which it will get colder. To what extent does seasonality drive the transmission of the virus? This is a big question mark over here, and this is a thing that we don't know. A priori, we might have expected a stronger seasonality effect, as we, for example, we know from influenza. That doesn't seem to be so strong here, but that doesn't say that it shouldn't exist at all. So what are the numbers in terms of at least some of the answers to the questions earlier? Well, we know that about 60 to 70% of India has sustained an infection already. This is still somewhat inhomogeneous, whether you look at Kerala or Maharashtra or the northeast of India, the numbers are not exactly the same. So this is just some very broad brush figure of 60 to 70%. Even about these numbers, there is controversy. Should this, if you sort of, I think 60%, 50 to 60% was probably the most sensible lower bound to that number. But the 70% in various estimates could be 80%, could even be 90% in terms of those who've been infected already. And these larger numbers are probably appropriate to cities such as Delhi and Mumbai. And the smaller numbers, if you sort of average over all of India, including the urban and the rural areas. There is one variant that is now pretty much dominant across much of India, the Delta variant. So most people have already, if they've been infected in both the first and the second round, it's likely that they have been infected with the Delta variant of the coronavirus. Regarding vaccines, of the eligible population of around 940 million, about 38% of them has already been vaccinated with at least one dose. And about 7%, a much smaller number, has been vaccinated with 2 doses already. We know that having at least 1 dose of the vaccine gives you some level of protection, and this is enhanced with 2 doses. But on the other hand, is it, as a policy question, is it better to vaccinate everyone or as many people as you can with 1 dose? And then after that, begin your 2 doses. Should you prioritize the 2 doses for frontline workers, healthcare workers, people with immune problems, people with, for example, with diabetes or other types of pre-existing conditions that predispose you to worse outcomes on an infection? These are questions of policy that have to be answered really within a modeling framework. We have to understand what might be good policy as opposed to bad policy. The number we know for reinfection is not very clear. Probably 5 to 20% is the best guess at this point. Hopefully, we will know a little bit more about this as we go forward. Vaccine breakthroughs, yes, we don't know that. We know of all of our friends, people who've been vaccinated and yet have developed the disease at a later point. But it's certainly true from all that we know that vaccines protect against severe disease and hospitalization. At some level, it doesn't really matter if you have mild symptoms of COVID-19. As long as you can get by with a fever for about a day and a half and a cough that lasts maybe for about 3 days, you're fine, really. What you need to watch out for is that you do not develop a severe version of the disease that needs you to go to an ICU, that needs you to be under oxygen, et cetera, and protects you against death. And that is something that vaccines more or less completely guarantee. Then the last question is numbers. How well do we know these numbers? I said 60 to 70%. I said various numbers about reinfections, et cetera. At what point do we go back and say, do we understand these numbers well enough? So here are numbers for the cumulative COVID-19 cases. And if you look at the number of reported cases, a little more than 30 million at this point. But this number underestimates the true number of people who have sustained an infection by a factor of somewhere between 20 and 30, best guess. So our own work in the first wave of COVID-19 suggests a number of around 20 by the end of the first wave. But then, of course, the second wave threw all of those numbers completely off. And the likelihood is that the underestimation became even larger at that point. So if you look at overall between the first and the second wave, a good guess might be somewhere between 20 and 30. But there really is no way we have at this point of sharpening that estimate a little better, unless we have much more detailed and long-term serological surveys that look at this. And the ICMR currently is planning such a survey. So deaths a little above 400,000. And here again, large question marks. Our own estimates for the first wave suggested the underestimation is about a factor of 2.2, a very, very sort of broad estimate there. But again, once you put the second wave in, once you put in everything we know about reports of excess deaths across multiple states of India, including Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, etc., that number is probably pushed up to 5. And in more doomsday types of scenarios, that number would be 7 or 8. I don't think so. I think 2.2 to about 5 is probably a reasonable estimate for what the undercounting is. But that still is a very large number. If you multiply 400,000 by 5, that's a large number of deaths. So many people, which is why I think right now it's hard to find, even on this panel or anywhere, it's hard to find someone who has not been touched either directly or indirectly by COVID-19 in terms of a close family member, someone in the extended family succumbing to COVID-19 or having some severe consequence of contracting COVID-19. Vaccinations, about 38% of the population of 940 million has been vaccinated. Only 7% has had 2 doses. The curve has now sped up a little bit. We were doing not too well on vaccines at about 3 to 4 million about 2 weeks ago. Now we're in the vicinity of 5 to 6 million. That's certainly an improvement. The 5 to 6 million maybe will last this month. 4 to 5 million, I would say, would last this month. Hopefully from August onwards, we will step this up. Ideally, we need to get to about 10 million vaccine doses, vaccine shots per day. And then we're in a better position overall to cope with any potential third wave that might come along. I just want to go over a couple of points that I think are important about what we understand about how to protect yourself, protect other people. What happens in workplaces? What is the least that we can do for workplaces in terms of our actions? The importance of evidence in terms of dictating policy. The importance of being real and not performative. Again, is something that is important. And the need for data. And I will quickly summarize some of these points. I will emphasize what we don't know, what we do know, and what we ought to be knowing in the future in order to go forward. What we do know very clearly now is that the virus is transmitted as an aerosol through small droplets that stay in the air for a long time. There was a big debate, a sort of vicious debate in academic terms about whether these were droplets that could fall down to the ground within about 1 to 2 meters of a person. Now we think that may not be the dominant mode of transmission. It's through smaller versions of droplets called aerosols. It can stay suspended in the air for a long period of time. And this is why being in an enclosed space such as a lift or a badly ventilated space such as theater is a bad idea. This is also why masks help. Masks help because they reduce the amount of aerosol that you emit if you're infected, and they reduce the amount of aerosol that can come in to your airways and nasal passages if you speak to someone infected. The other thing is even the act of speaking. It doesn't even have to be a violent cough or expectoration. Even the act of speaking is sufficient to release aerosols into the air, which is why masking is important. The Swiss cheese model is a particularly nice epidemiological way of thinking about how to protect yourself. The idea is that Swiss cheeses are these little slices of cheeses with big holes in between. And you should think about the many measures that you can take as being successive slices of Swiss cheese. So what's important here is that even though none of these is individually perfect, for example, maintaining physical distancing, doing masking, social interventions, etc., all of these technically have some holes in them. Nothing is perfect. But if you can do all of them together at some level, then the holes in one can be covered by the unexposed cheese in the other. And therefore, at the end of the slice of cheeses, you can have an overall protection that line. So this is a very visual way of thinking about protection. So we and others have been emphasizing the role of ventilation as something that we haven't taken seriously enough. And once you understand that COVID-19 is transmitted through a respiratory route and through small aerosols, then suddenly the importance of ventilation jumps into prominence. So with groups across India at the IITs and other places, we've been looking at what sort of ventilation is appropriate, for example, in a toilet, in a room, etc. And one interesting feature of this is something called the Agarbatti test, which we explained in an article that we wrote about a few weeks ago. And that tries to, is a simple, inexpensive, cost-effective way of figuring out what is the nature of ventilation. Are there local regions where you can trap droplets of aerosol, or aerosols in for a much longer term than you might think if you imagine that you had a smooth flow of air across the room by just opening doors and windows. And my screen seems to be stuck at this point. Let me try again. Yeah, sorry. Okay, something seems to be wrong here. Yeah, so this is the article that we wrote on the role of ventilation in preventing COVID-19 transmission. The second point I wanted to make was this question of being real and not performative. So here's something from the newspaper: plan to spray aerial disinfectant over Bangalore to curb COVID spread, put on hold over environmental concern. Completely obvious that there should be environmental concern. Completely obvious again that this is a stupid thing to do. That pouring disinfectant across Bangalore is really not a sensible way to deal with the disease. It is primarily airborne in its way. Look at the crowds on the right, panic buying in Tamil Nadu, shops open after intense lockdown. It's completely natural for people to want to go out after having been locked up for a period. It's completely natural and important for people to buy. But could the nature of regulation, how does one think about the social context of dealing with the pandemic in the long term? This is something that we need to think about. And that's why communication is important. And the fact that you must provide reasons for why, for a particular action, and what sense that makes in a larger context. Here is sort of from an article about the need for data. And this article pointed out that India has by now collected an incomparable amount of data. It has more data than anywhere else in the world for testing and for various other types of consequences of COVID-19. The Delta variant was first reported in India and is now spread across the world. And given the data that it has, we can address detailed questions of how vaccines work. At least the vaccine that we have, the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Covaxin vaccine, against this and other variants of concern. And making this data freely available to those who can analyze it, both in India and across the world, would be a first step to readying both India as well as the world. We do have a responsibility to the larger globe around us to understanding COVID-19 better, so that it is in nobody's interest that in some other part of the world, not just here, that cases continue to grow. Because as cases grow, new variants will be seen. As new variants will be seen, nothing can be contained for a long period of time. It invariably will escape. So this is, in a sense, a very common need. So let me summarize with these sort of points. Is there likely to be a third wave? This is not necessary. But on the other hand, caution is certainly required at this point. We've seen the examples of the other countries which showed ups and downs and ups and downs. There's nothing to suggest that we might not have something similar in the future. But with sufficient caution, this is something that certainly we can curb any very steep rise, for example, that we saw in the second wave, and hopefully that can be made mild. Gradients and inequity, and both Ashwini and Amita pointed out, the nature of inequities in society are very important, and this is, in fact, turns up in the epidemiological data as well. If you look at the first wave, if you look at the distinction between urban slums and the high rises that completely abutted those slums, there was a difference of about 20 to 30% in the incidence in the cases reported in the slums, which were much higher compared to those in the high rises. And this gradually evened out in the second wave. Reducing cases, as I pointed out, is important because any case, anywhere, any large number of cases can seed the appearance of new variants. Young people affected disproportionately, this is a question that has come up a lot. And the answer is no, from whatever data that we have. There's a little question mark on that from very, very recent data. But even that number is a very, very marginal increase over whatever number existed earlier. So I think the fact that we seem to see more younger people affected in the second wave is likely a consequence of the fact that there were more people affected overall in the second wave. And a fixed fraction of that overall larger number is still a large number. So the Great Barrington Declaration sort of made sounds along the lines of it's just a flu, we needn't worry about it, we need to get people back to work as soon as possible. It's completely clear that this is not the case, that this is not the flu. It's at least about 20 times more dangerous in terms of mortality than the flu is. Vaccines don't work, again, a piece of misinformation. They're not perfect, but they're certainly ample. They certainly work very well reducing the risk of severe disease. Right now, major concern maybe is vaccine hesitancy. We've reached in the 45 plus and the 65 plus, 60 plus category thresholds of about 60 to 70%. How do we move further on that? Have we sort of reached the limit at which the last 20 to 30% of people are people who don't want to get the vaccine because they fear that it might affect them in some way? And so how to combat this attitude is important for us in the future. There's much that we don't know about the long-term consequences of COVID. After you've had a COVID infection, what happens? This is called long COVID. Again, this is where we need better registries, more comprehensive information about that tracks patients over long periods of time to see what this is. Mental health was mentioned, I think, by Amrita. There are long-term consequences of basically depriving people, especially children, of the sort of social contacts that they need when they grow up. And I think this is again mentioned by Amrita, although maybe she didn't use this term, One Health approaches that integrate human beings, the environment, veterinary health, that are conscious of the links between the human beings and their environment and what we're doing to our environment. These are central to thinking about not just COVID-19, but all sorts of similar diseases that are zoonotic in character and that form 3 out of the 4 new emerging diseases in the world today. So with that, let me just stop and thank all of you.
Thank you so much, Professor Menon, for that wonderful presentation, including various epidemiological models and walking us through with substantive data that you have put in your presentation, and also for giving us the necessary preventive tips on how to prevent, how to prevent COVID-19 from happening. So we now move to our final speaker, Professor Meghla Krishnamurthy. Ma'am, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of, I think, what is, as Professor Menon said, such a wide-ranging and also far-reaching discussion. And as I was listening to everyone, it struck me that this is exactly the central challenge that we've had over the last year plus with COVID, is that we've had to process very rapidly a lot of new information and new data and really sort of pay deep amounts of attention to the present and a very fast changing present, while at the same time recognizing and realizing the systemic fault lines and the structural fault lines on which this pandemic has, unfolded in all of our lives. And I think Professor Deshpande raised many of these questions in terms of whether it's gender, Professor Babaskar, whether it's ecology. These were long-standing, structural fissures on which we had already built. And so I think it's been this challenge of constantly looking at what is right in front of us, but also what has been behind us. And in order to try and understand as we think about what is the way forward. I will apologize since I'm in the way of you and questions, so I will be as quick as possible. And you've already heard many different perspectives. Secondly, I'll apologize because I don't have a presentation. I took the invitation to be conversational very seriously, but I wanted to use this opportunity to reflect a little bit as an anthropologist of the state and the market on what COVID has thrown up for us as we think about the relationship between the Indian state and the market, so markets and the economy as we have come to think about it, and the public and the private. And maybe that will also take us forward into the questions, because they raise, I think, some fundamental dilemmas for how we are to think about institutions and accountability going forward. I think Professor Deshpande already mentioned and talked in a lot of detail about how when we reached this point and we hit COVID, the Indian economy was already in a crisis, and it was, had been badly hit and was not doing well at all. We were seeing declining wages, we were seeing problems with demand that were very, very clear, and of course, agriculture, which is a sector that I study, had been in a sort of crisis for quite a long time. And it is, I'll begin with agriculture because there is something there about resilience as well. So as the Indian economy took a terrible hit and had completely, Professor Sarkar talked about unprecedented levels of contraction and devastation. The one sector that a lot of people talked about was as a silver lining or a green lining was agriculture, right? Because it actually showed a 3.4% growth last year. And this is interesting and important to pay attention to because, COVID actually struck, the first wave and the lockdown struck exactly at the time of Rabi harvesting and marketing. And there were grave concerns about what would actually happen. And this has been a very difficult year for farmers. But what has been remarkable is the way in which these systems did galvanize on the ground. And you saw a very, remarkable degree of resilience in our rural systems, our agricultural systems, and our markets to plow the fields again. And this was aided by the fact that last year we had a good monsoon. That although delayed, agriculture required a second notification in order to be mentioned. But although delayed, the state quickly realized that it was one sector that had to be opened up. I don't know if many of you remember, but having said that, that wasn't easy for farmers. There were lots of stories in the first few months of the first lockdown where you saw farmers being physically harmed, experiencing bodily blockages, and of course vendors who have been a lifeline of ensuring that food markets and food supplies actually kept moving in our urban locations, experienced a lot of violence from both state officials and the public. It was not an easy time for any of them to function. There were lots of disruptions. Usually the intimate interconnections that keep our food systems going are not visible. When there are breakdowns of this kind, many interconnections become visible, and then you realize the kind of labor and work that it takes to sustain these very complex movements on a day-to-day, everyday basis. So that actually became very palpable during this time. But we did see record numbers of production and procurement. We also had a moment which was really, this was a massive food crisis. And it is worth pointing out that, again, people reflected on the fact that we had food grain stocks. So one, critical factors, in addition to the monsoon, that it was the systems in which we had already invested, the public distribution system, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, NREGA. It was record numbers of procurement where government does procure historically. That kicked into action. And, these are precisely the programs that in the run-up to COVID have been attacked as drains, as, the kinds of investments the state should not be making. Buffer stocks are not required. We have so much surplus grain, all of this. But if there were lifelines to turn to give our people some support during what was a tremendous crisis, it was these programs, right? Where cooperative agencies existed, milk procurement meant that they were able to buy surplus milk production. Where you had, actually existing institutions in the rural areas, they were able to galvanize. Where you had decentralized capacity, people were able to think about innovative ways of reaching out care. Because we haven't invested enough in all of this over the decades, many people got left out even of these systems. So in recent writings, people have pointed out, repeatedly scholars have pointed out that much of the work that CEDA has also done has shown that, people also got left out. And they got left out because we have actually created hardwired inclusion into these systems beforehand. Right? So many people didn't have ration cards. This is one of the reasons migrant workers were not able to get care. And 1 year later, one nation, one ration card is still largely on paper. It hasn't materialized, right? These were things that we should have been able to do. And the system wasn't able to move where it didn't exist already from a supply side system to one that responded to demand. Right? Because that requires you to have decentralization, that requires you to have high levels of trust. And so we are so programmed as a state to look for errors of inclusion, to make sure that people who are undeserving don't get it. We don't know how to make sure those who deserve get it, right? And this was something you cannot suddenly fix in a pandemic. You cannot suddenly move from a supply side model to a demand side or demand driven model. And I think that is one very, very important lesson that we've had to learn. And I think data, Professor Menon's already mentioned, is so critical here. One of the reasons that we had the central government say that they could not reach out to migrant workers was because we didn't know who they are. We don't have a database. So if we don't know who they are, we don't have the data. How do we do it, right? Professor Deshpande has mentioned the cash transfers, and again, people were already missing off roads, off the systems. So you could have activated systems, but if you use something like PM Kisan, you had to have the farmers already in the database. We know that sharecroppers are not included. We know that tenant farmers are not included. We know that our databases aren't good enough, and we haven't invested in these prior. So I think one major lesson was that where we had invested, we were able to galvanize the local state, where those endowments did exist. These endowments have been the ones that have come under question and pressure by Indian state and reform for the last 20 years. So the fact that they held up to the extent that they held up, I think is really important. The fact that we have hardwired these systems to be exclusive is problematic. This goes deeper into questions of a state that trusts its people and that trusts itself, and systems that actually work. That is the work we have to do going forward. Right? I'll come back to the health system, because again, we saw repeatedly that after all this work about privatization, moving towards managed care models, PMJY, insurance-based universal health coverage, it was the already existing public health system that had to kick into action. Right? And where it worked, particularly in rural areas, it was already existing systems. Right? The private sector was not the predominant driver in this. And I think we have to understand that. And this is something that, when the elite, as Professor Bavaskar said, has sort of suddenly realized that no amount of money can get them the oxygen or the care that they needed, although they had more money and they got it first. It's incredibly difficult to kind of comprehend what it's like for most Indians on a regular basis. So I think, again, the public health system and the need to invest in healthcare and in education, which should have been done over the last many, many decades, right? So I think that's the second point that I want to make. I do want to make just a couple of other key points, and then I will wrap up. The first is that our frontline workers, and this is what the nature of the Indian state, Professor Sarkar mentioned that we now think about health workers and other frontline functionaries, but this has been an incredibly difficult pandemic for them. I mean, we've already talked about the gender dimensions of the pandemic and its impacts, but female health workers, the Ashas and the Anganwadi workers and the auxiliary nurse midwives have had an incredibly difficult time. So, for example, Behen Box has done very important research that shows that the burden of work has gone up, the number of hours that they've served. They have seen, Asha workers have seen a drop of income of 1,000 to 5,000 rupees a month during the pandemic. But over 80% of those surveyed actually have seen a drop in their income. The debt burden of these workers has gone up. Over 30% of them did not receive any PPE. And I think it's really important to say that insurance claims have not been honored. Their death on duty has not even been recognized. Right? So we are also failing the same frontline workers that we have referred to repeatedly as COVID warriors. But also when it comes to vaccination, many states did not include many government functionaries, whether they are electricity metering officers, whether they are postal service officers, in their frontline functionaries. Right? So they were not vaccinated in those early days when they should have been vaccinated, because they've all been on the field throughout. So I think that is another area where who we count and who we think of as the state. Right? We typically focus a lot of our attention on the IAS and senior civil servants and on politicians and political leadership, but the actual arms and legs of the state and are the frontline workers, right? And they have really had a very, very difficult time. So I think that visibility and that experience is also important. And finally, I think just to the structural points, we did an interesting survey of IAS officers during the pandemic, where we, had over 500 officers and across cadres and ages and generations in the IAS respond. And it was very interesting. The vast majority of them felt greater autonomy, decentralization were critical. Vast number of them actually showed a great amount of motivation and felt that the state had even responded in a crisis. Some of them said right before the second wave, when we talked to them in Jan and Feb and March, that they would change their view that the state had in fact invested in health systems during the pandemic. They felt it was, in some senses, what Professor Menon said, more performative than actual, because they saw resources come in, but by the time the second wave hit, a lot of that had been dismantled or had not been adequately shored up. So the investments weren't adequate, although we saw that happen in the beginning of the wave. But what was so interesting is that they were split down the middle. 50% of them felt the lockdown was too soon, the first lockdown, that there should have been more planning. States which have invested in decentralization and planning felt we should have planned mitigation better. Right? 80% of them felt public communication was vital. But when it came down to what did the public listen to, 45% of them felt it was the coercive power of the state rather than willing cooperation that actually led to compliance. Right? What this is pointing out is much deeper fault lines in the way in which we deliver public services, in the way in which we structure public administration, and the relationship between the state and the citizen, right? We see these tensions, and I think these are really important, fundamental tensions that we need to start exploring and thinking as we rebuild or think about strengthening government systems. And finally, I'll end a little bit on the economy and on the market, because I think for a very long time, there was this sense that the government should only engage, and there has been the received wisdom of 30 years of reforms. We are at this point where we are looking at 30 years, 3 decades of the 1991 reforms, that, reforms mean getting the state out of the way. Reforms mean deregulation. Reforms mean the state should only enter if there is a very narrowly defined sense of market failure. But what we have seen during this pandemic, and what we were beginning to see before, right, is that the state, and as we think about it, the public, is vital in thinking about shaping public value. And there it's not just about correcting for market failures, but it is about thinking about public investment and state capacity in a way that really reshapes these systems, right? And it's not just about letting the markets function, it's also about reshaping these relationships. And I think so much greater thinking about public investment, going back to think about the nature of Indian federalism is, absolutely vital. Our federal compact is also in crisis. The social contract is also in crisis. But I think we've seen that these investments do pay off. They matter. The people matter most, and that these institutions and public institutions have to be strengthened if we're going to address this going forward. So I think it's really a time for us to rethink and reimagine and reinvest in our understanding of what it means to have accountable government, accountable state, and the kind of relationships between states and markets that allow us to think about much, much greater equity and public value. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Krishnamurthy. It was so wonderful listening to such an amazing presentation that you gave, and how public is interested in shaping public values. You brought forth that quite well. Thank you so much. And as I see the time, now that we heard the panel make their opening statements and flag some concerns, I would now like to invite the panelists to raise questions to the fellow panelists to get more out of their presentation. As much as we would like this discussion to be interactive, please be brief in your answers so that we can accommodate more questions within our time slots. I would also request the audience to please put your questions in the chat box, and we'll take them up eventually. Please, sir. Please use the raise hand feature, and then I think one can just take it up. Yeah. Okay, Professor Jamil has a question. Sir, please.
Yeah, so thanks. I have a question for you, Ashwini. I've always wondered why, through this economic distress, the stock market has done so well.
Yeah, so this should not be a surprise, but it is often to many people that the stock market has very little to do with the actual economy, which is the real economy that produces goods and services, and people buy and are engaged in the production of those. So, to give you one example, so stock markets are mechanisms for investment for the global investor, right? And the resilience or the going, the ups and downs of the stock market have a lot to do with what's happening elsewhere in the world. So, for example, if the rates that the United States economy for a particular investor, investor wanting to invest, if they feel that in the US market the rates are not good, they might turn to India in a short-term investment because they feel that the Indian market is giving them a good return. But remember that these are short-term financial flows. So tomorrow, if Brazilian markets were to give a better flow, they'll immediately withdraw their money from the Indian stock market and invest them in Brazil. There are some global sort of synchronous ups and downs. So, for example, COVID hits or something, so all stock markets go down or something like that, right? But the investments in individual stock markets, I have reflect very little the underlying structural sort of capacities or growth of the economy, but reflect more um, the desire to earn quick returns. And that's why this money keeps flowing about very rapidly across different stock markets. There's a lot about the stock markets that I don't understand. So I'm not going to venture into areas that do, but what I do know is that it's not I know that people refer to the stock markets as markets, and that often is a confusing thing in itself. Because to me, the market is the real market which reflects people's purchasing power and ability to buy, which incidentally is in crisis in India. But you wouldn't know that if you looked at the Indian stock market. But thank you for asking that question.
If I can just throw in one additional point, which is actually the way in which COVID has exacerbated the sort of inequality between the formal and the informal, because the informal sector and MSMEs and have done so badly. Actually, the formal sector, some of the larger formal corporates have actually gained. So you see what Pranjal Bhandari calls distress formalization as well. So, this is another area where exactly, as we said, the real actually existing Indian economy is overwhelmingly small scale and informal. And doesn't get access to many of these kinds of, even the relief measures on credit and other aspects. Whereas actually the economy has seen an increased formalization, but it's not the informal becoming stronger and larger. It is them actually struggling to compete as a result of the pandemic, where you've actually seen formal entities become larger, right? And that kind of inequality has also had an impact here. So it's not, you're absolutely right that one, it's like what happens with the stock market and why they're doing certainly so well, but it's a very large number of small number of large formal entities who are on, even those who are on the stock market. And this has actually strengthened their hand because we don't make policy for the informal sector. And when we think about them, we think about only formalization, right? And I'm not against formalization per se. There are many benefits to be gained with that process. But like you mentioned, like Professor Deshpande mentioned with GST, it doesn't work because we don't have an imagination for the real, actually existing economy.
If I may also just jump into that interesting point about the formalization and the informalization. And that's to point out that, as you well know, Professor Krishnamurthy and Professor Deshpande, that it's selective, that financial formalization does not then get equalized by having formal rights for workers. Most formal companies, including educational institutions, rely on large numbers of contract employees who don't have the kinds of benefits that the formal white-collar people with secure employment do. So even these terms, formal and informal, we need to ask, what particular ways are they organized? Is financial organization registering for GST That's just one part of it. The other part of it is the labor practices in that particular organization, be it a household enterprise, be it an MSME, which is bigger, or be it a large scale company.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Now, Professor Menon, please.
Yeah, I had a question for Professor Krishnamurthy and then Professor Bhaviskar, maybe in that order. Mekla, you mentioned that I think 40 to 50% of the IAS officers that you polled said that the punitive and the coercive part of the state was necessary to get people to behave in ways that were appropriate to dealing with the pandemic. I mean, this question comes up from at many places. What is the best way to get the public at large to do things that prevent a pandemic from spreading? And usually the feeling is that coercion is the last thing that you should be trying. And education, communication, maybe from people who are respected in that community, start at a small scale and then work upward, are better ways of doing this. But I'm sort of surprised to see that such a large fraction of them felt that coercion was very important, and otherwise people would not listen. So I just wanted to get both your opinions on this, on the necessity for this as a strategy in the first place, or the usefulness of this.
Thanks. No, it was actually a really interesting finding. It was also something that the officers themselves have reflected a lot on afterwards, right? And sort of trying to think about why is this the case. A further nuance to that was that the front-runner states, and these are now Niti Aayog classifies Indian states into nobody does badly, everybody is aspirant, performing, and front-runner. Front-runner states are Kerala, Himachal, Tamil Nadu, states which have actually done relatively well, and then UP, Bihar, at the time of our classification were the aspirant states, the ones who didn't. Now, it was the UP, Bihar officers disproportionately who actually said this is more about coercion, right, or as much. And so when we look at the breakdown, it was, 44% of those officers in aspirant states who said that the public understood the need for restrictions and cooperated, and over 56% said that it was actually coercion and the fear of law that led to it. Whereas if you look at the front-runner states, it was the opposite. It was 64% who said it was actually cooperation, and only 36% who said it was fear of law. 36% is still a high number, but there's a difference. So state cultures also matter. Decentralization matters. How much capacity you build on the ground level and actually have in your system also matters, right? And so I don't think it's an entirely, and I think that's part of the answer. Those are the same officers that had a sense that you could mitigate impact. You should have been able to plan better. They had greater faith in planning, rather than in the coercive force of a lockdown and nothing else being able to work. They had greater faith in their own systems. Interestingly, a number of officers found frontline functionaries extremely effective, felt public communication was absolutely vital, felt that they're not trained in any way in public communication. And we found a similar thing in terms of even working with private sector or working with civil society. Right? The higher your state's capacity to decentralize, the more you're willing to collaborate and work. So I think part of the lesson, not all of it, I mean, there's obviously trust in government is an extremely complex thing. And I think COVID has thrown up many, many, many insights about how much you trust government and how much you think you have a right to freedom and all kinds of other questions. But I do think one part of this answer, right, is building up public trust. And that requires us to invest in a very different approach. A young IAS officer who just reached his first posting said he was welcomed by the other officer who said, "You've come to rule. Are you ready to rule?" Right? And that tells you something about how we are training our administrators and how they think about the central challenge of the public. Interestingly, for both you and Professor Jamil, there was a similar tendency when you ask about contact tracing and about vaccines. There's a great tendency to put the blame on the public, right? So rather than focus on your own capacity to deliver better services, more, it is to say that it was ostracism, stigma, that led to these systems. And when you talk to officers, again, they say very openly, they say, you have not seen the kind of ostracism and stigma that we have experienced on the ground. And I think they are right to say that. But at the same time, the tendency to say the system cannot overcome this. And it's actually about the system's responsibility to do so, I think is an important thing to correct. Amita.
I agree entirely, Meghla. I think that the relationship between the state and people in terms of the extent of decentralization is a crucial part of whether people trust messages that the state gives. Much of my research was in the poorest part of Madhya Pradesh, in its southwest corner, where people have a history. Over generations, what they've experienced is that state programs can't be taken at face value. People say go to the hospital, but their experience of hospital is that they're going to, come away with infections. Then they're going to, face huge medical expenses that they did not anticipate. So there's a general mistrust, which is not because, people are conservative. It's because that has been their experience. So changing that experience of the state is something that's going to take a lot of time. And as Professor Krishnamurthy said, the experience differs from state to state. Where states have administrations that are more proactive, where people trust them, you see that the need for coercive measures is much low. But the sad part of it is that, in fact, the government is, by and large, also familiar with coercive measures. All sorts of agencies, like the Forest Department, which has no reason to do so, thinks of itself as a paramilitary force to exclude people. A lot of other government service providers also see people as a nuisance to be tolerated at best. That they have the power, and people have to somehow bow to them and defer to them. So as long as that asymmetry exists, the likelihood is that people are not going to respond to suggestions or public public campaigns. They are going to want fairly strict measures to be imposed, and that's unfortunate, but that's to do with transforming that larger relationship in the long run.
In terms of communication, I just wanted to highlight something that happened with me. You may remember that early in the pandemic, there was an advertisement on television where Amitabh Bachchan was telling people to wear masks. And I thought it was a good thing that there is a star who's telling people to wear masks. And my driver said something very interesting. He said, why is this man telling us to wear a mask when he himself got COVID? And when we choose people to talk about, to communicate the value of mitigation, I think even the choice is important. Choose people who are not just public figures, but also have the right sort of compliance, so to say. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting point.
Our dear panelists, I would love to just initiate this discussion, but then there's a paucity of time in here, and I see very interesting and pertinent questions from the side of the audience. Here is one question from Sujay Dhanagare. He asked, agriculture was actually the saving grace during the lockdown as it witnessed growth. Many migrant laborers went back and worked in agriculture. Agriculture is already facing the issue of income stagnation. So what impact of workers in agriculture would happen on income? What impact do you think it will have on agriculture and agricultural practices? Do you think there would be environmental consequences if more intensive practices are adopted to raise this income? Professor Krishnamurthy, yes. Yeah.
I just, I just to pick up on Professor Jamil's last point, though, I think, for example, when he's thinking about good messaging, one very, very convincing good messaging comes from doctors, because the number of doctors affected compared to the number of doctors who've shown up for work every single day and have not been affected is remarkable. So if you want evidence that masks can work, just simply good masking, those who are out there are quite, I know many of them have been infected, but the numbers that haven't are also quite remarkable. On the, agriculture question, let me say two quick things. I think you absolutely rightly pointed out that there's a structural problem. The reason agriculture did relatively well last year was there was a good confluence of three things that happened. There was a good monsoon, agriculture was relatively allowed to function and people did move. The pandemic hadn't really hit rural areas in the same way last time. And you also saw very strong government action in terms of procurement. By the second half of the year, you also saw a correction in prices as a result of global commodity prices correcting themselves. This year, we're actually looking at a very challenging situation. The monsoon, as many people have noticed, is not looking particularly good at the moment. There is the latest IMD forecast has talked about the possibility of a negative Indian Ocean dipole. We may be looking at something which is not very favorable, and that is something of genuine concern. But we're also looking at the fact that where does the Indian government support agriculture? It really supports cereals, right? And that's wheat and paddy and rice, even in procurement and in many other kinds of support. So what you actually saw last year is that farmers invested more in exactly those crops that are agroecologically not the way forward for us, right? And what we haven't invested in are pulses. And last year, both floriculture, horticulture did very poorly. So this requires a relook at how we think about agriculture and agricultural policies. You're absolutely right. Greater intensification, greater support, and a cereal-centric government policy will not help Indian agriculture going forward. We are going to have a large number of people dependent on agriculture, and the best way to grow the economy is to think about agriculture doing well and leading to a surplus sustained diversification rather than a distress driven diversification. This requires a complete rethink of our agricultural policy. Unfortunately, we have led in with this idea of deregulation as the solution, and the Indian agricultural markets are quite largely private in any case. So what we really need to do is, this goes back to the kinds of comments that I think Professor Baviskar was making, is, understand again agroecology and these relationships, and think about, government policy that is far more supportive of this transition. We do not do good policy for transitions. Right? We've stuck with a strong rice and wheat centric policy for 40 years now. So what we need are transitional investments, and again, that kind of approach to agriculture. So I think we are looking at a tougher year potentially, but I think fundamentally we need to look at the long term differently.
Thank you so much, Professor Krishnamurthy. Here is a question from Chandra Pandey. Status quo in growth versus ecology debate is a road to nowhere, generally on practical grounds. What are the factors or indices we need to include for the holistic definition of growth as the way forward? Professor Ashwini and Professor Baviskar, would you like to take up that? You're muted.
Let Amita take that.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think Ashwini has a lot to say. We'll probably have a lot to say on this too, because I think economists are rather belatedly now thinking about economic statistics in a way that means not just charting growth as growth in gross domestic product, but also at looking at ideas of stocks of national wealth, which includes ecological wealth. So if you're destroying your wealth in order to have high rates of growth, well, it's not a sustainable strategy, is it? So I think there is rethinking, but whether that rethinking and reconceptualization results in action is, of course, the million-dollar question. Does that mean that this debate about economics, economic growth versus ecological sustainability is meaningless? I don't think so at all, because I think what we find in the real world are lots and lots of people who care about the ecological question because they are directly dependent on these natural resources for their survival. And it's these people who are taking action either through fighting to defend their lands, defend their fisheries, defend their water bodies, or they are joining other people who are protesting these on grounds of environmental consequences and so on. This debate is not dead at all. And I think what the pandemic has actually done is in many ways to revive it and give it greater momentum at a time where the idea that economic growth is the greatest and only good has been reigning as a dominant ideology of capitalism around the world for the last 30 years, if not more. This is an ideology that is constantly being challenged. And what we need to think about are ways of supporting this effort to challenge ideas, to have fresh thinking, rather than saying, oh, well, this is an old debate. It's dead in the water. Why bother with it?
Yeah, can I just add? Yeah, so I agree with Amita. The thing is that if you look at the community of economists today, this sort of opinion that favors just economic growth at regardless of any other consequence is a sort of now a fringe opinion, which is a good thing, I guess. So things like inequality or thinking about social identity, that were not so mainstream within economists, say 30 years ago, that has changed completely. Today, if an economist did some empirical work and did not talk about social identity, that would be considered really strange. Similarly, the focus on GDP alone or the belief in trickle down and all of these things, that let's have growth first, then we'll use the surplus from growth to then fix other things that went wrong during the growth process. Those ideas have, I'm not saying they have no takers, but that would be within economists now. That is the fringe rather than the other way around earlier, when those who spoke about bringing these kinds of concerns were regarded as the fringe. So sustainable growth is now more or less, to argue against sustainable growth would be very odd, uh, at least within the academic economists, and also including, in all the funding agencies, etc., etc. Just as you have to show awareness of gender or other social cleavages, you also have to show that whatever solution you're proposing is also sustainable. The real challenge, I think, is our trade-offs. So for example, you think of the crop burning and you think of the groundwater, the law against prevention of depletion of groundwater and how that led to shortening of the cycle and the pressures to crop burn. So that demonstrates one in unintended consequences that could not have been were not foreseen, not that they could not have been, but they were not. And as well as trade-offs. So you try to fix one thing and in the process, are you creating another problem? And I think those are the really difficult questions that don't have easy solutions. So I think what we grapple with, I'm not an ecological economist, but I think what ecological economists grapple with are trade-offs. And I think that those are pretty serious. But I think, the asker of this question, I've forgotten the name, but I think though that sort of trickle down or growth first and everything else later kind of a view is not that common any longer within economists.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Deshpande, for taking, and Professor Bhaviska for taking up that question. Now we take up the last question, and it's a very logical question to a person. And this question is directed to Professor Menon. When the first wave hit India, we locked down too early. This is the argument that's coming forward. And when the second wave hit India, we locked down too late. How do we decide the timing of a lockdown in a country such as India, Professor? If you could quickly, say that in pointers.
That's a really hard question, mainly because it pinches on questions of how individuals react. If everybody just stayed at home, even if you didn't announce a lockdown, but you said that situation is dire, please stay at home as much as you can, that will slow down the progress of any disease that passes from person to person. So then governments have to try and gauge what is feasible, what will people actually do, and at what point. And that is, I think, a very, very hard thing to do. So my feeling is that the first lockdown, if you think about it, no country can afford to keep a disease at bay permanently, an infectious disease of this. I mean, you look at what Australia is going through, or Vietnam or other countries. Ideally, if you were an island, you might have done a very good job at keeping people, because someone has to fly in. or come in by boat in order to reach your island. India is not an island. It's very well connected to its neighbors, to distant countries. So whatever we might have done, COVID would have spread in India, I think is reasonable to say. The only thing that we can do is to try and avoid what happened in the second wave, which is a very steep rise in cases that would have overwhelmed the health system. That didn't happen in the first wave, but it certainly happened in the second wave. And this again points to the difficulties of how to decide policy. I mean, from one point of view, the first wave lockdown was a success. Cases grew slowly. They stayed within bounds of whatever your health system could manage, but it had huge other costs in terms of the difficulties of migrant labor or people moving back. So how do you weigh these costs against each other is a question that I don't know the answer to, and there may not be an easy answer. I think with the second wave, it was genuinely a mistake to allow it to take off so fast. And already the warning signals were there by about the middle of February to the end of February. And I think there, a certain level of overconfidence, I think, was responsible for the fact that we didn't react far enough. We had opened up too fast. We allowed political activity, religious activity, etc. That we should not have done. We should have been alert. I mean, no country can again lock down forever. One has to open up, but one must be judicious about how one opens up and be very, very sensitive to the sort of signals that might be coming in. And those signals were in place by the 15th of February. People were writing about it. Top quality journalism coming out from remote areas in Maharashtra, pointing to the sudden rise of cases in rural parts of Maharashtra and Kola and other places like that. So we knew at that time, we knew about the increase in cases in Punjab and Delhi at that point. Had we been more stringent at that point, we might have prevented what happened in the second wave. But again, as I point out, this is a difficult decision. There is no universal answer to this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Menon. Here's very interesting question coming from Professor Krishnamurthy. Ma'am, please.
Sorry, actually, it's for both Professor Menon and Professor Jamil. It linked to this question about when to lock down, and progression is actually about your reflections at this point about the relationship between expertise, science, public knowledge, and public policy. To close this, because it links to that point about how are we engaging, and you've both been so deeply involved in looking at this as practitioners, and just your reflections on the direction that's going in, and how do we redefine that relationship, particularly because reinvestment in public science, the kinds of institutions we need, the credibility of expertise, how do we get to listen and build some of the debates that have happened around protocols. So it'd just be great to hear your reflections as we think forward, because this is a public health crisis, as it is many other kinds of crises all in one. But yeah,
I'll go first and let Shahid have the last word.
Please be brief.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I think there is this feeling that there's an antagonistic relationship between government and people outside government in terms of data accessibility, in terms of commentary on government actions. And, for example, as I've emphasized many times, the accessibility of data is an issue. The ICMR has a large amount of data that, with suitable analysis, would be very useful to understanding what happens what happened in the past, what's happening now, what could happen in the future. People outside government agencies have no access to that. And so this tendency of government to keep data very close to itself, not allow people from outside to access it, is something that's an old problem, it's a perennial problem. That's something that one has to surmount. There's very high quality people working outside the government system who could have contributed at various points into this analysis, which has not happened. So a sort of closer relationship between people interested in modeling, analysis, data, etc., is required, and I hope that will be there in the future. Shahid, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I was going to start where Gautam ended the previous question. There is this tendency to believe that lockdowns will prevent the spread of infection. They don't. Lockdowns actually slow the spread of infection. And what they do is buy you time to set things right. And the way our first lockdown happened at literally 4 hours notice, we were completely unprepared. And while we locked down early, data shows that only in the first phase of the lockdown, we showed much of an effect on disease spread. After that, the next 3 phases of the lockdown, there was only a marginal effect on the spread of infection. So we although we locked down early, we didn't plan properly. Even if we had locked down maybe a week later, but then had planned everything, that would have been sort of better. And we possibly may not have seen the kind of distress that we saw and that all of you talked about. Uh, there was discussion on trust, and trust comes from being transparent and speaking the truth. There was a serious lack of all of that. So normally, issues of science are often complex, and people will not understand them unless there is an element of trust behind them. And clearly that was missing. I mean, if we look back at how the healthcare establishment, the public health establishment of India managed the pandemic, the biggest disaster has been that a research organization, which is the Indian Council of Medical Research, was allowed to manage the pandemic. ICMR doesn't have the expertise. ICMR doesn't have the wherewithal to manage a pandemic. There's something called the Integrated Disease Surveillance Program. There is the National Center for Disease Control. They are the ones, the National Disaster Management Authority, they are the ones who should have been managing the pandemic, with ICMR providing research support. What is research support? Research support is developing diagnostic tests that are sensitive enough to do good sero surveys. You realize that all the sero surveys that have been done, you can't rely very much on them simply because the testing systems used are not adequate testing systems. That is what ICMR should have been doing. Instead of, ICMR is deciding whether we should buy drones to deliver vaccines to remote areas. I mean, come on. India controlled polio without a mobile phone app and without drones. Whatever we learned in the control of polio, we did not apply those public health lessons in this pandemic. So there were, really serious goof-ups made. And I hope that, going forward, we will strengthen our, public health network, our public health system, the disease surveillance system. And, what India needs today is something like a Centers for Disease Control. An Indian CDC is what is required. And a CDC alone will not help unless you have the right kind of workforce that is trained to deal with public health emergencies and people to deal with people who have the kind of training to, do disease surveillance in animals populations as well as human populations. So something also like an epidemiology intelligence service that the USCDC runs. Unless you have a cadre like this, we are going to continue to, deal with these emergencies in a very fragmented manner. I think time has come to unify these things, and hopefully that lesson would have been learned.
Thank you so much, Professor Jameel, for those interesting bits that you covered at the very last. You almost saved me from a conclusion. We need a CDC out in there and a different cadre to deal with it. Well, friends, we are at the close of this 2-hour discussion. The second wave has been devastating in more ways that we can think of, and now we see a foreseeable future. I'm sure you will agree with me when I say all of us know someone who got COVID-19. In this panel, we covered very diverse issues, ranging from ecology to agriculture to vaccination, data, and state capacity. Thank you to the esteemed panel for sharing your valuable insights. I would also like to thank our Vice Chancellor, Professor Malavika Sharkar, for her continued support, Dean of Research, Professor L. Shashidhara, Director of Centers for Emerging Technologies, Mr. Vikas Sani, for curating this panel discussion and putting it together, Emphasis and the Ashoka Distinguished Policy Speaker Series team, Altakshi and Nikhil for their marketing and logistical support. Well, None of us are safe unless all of us are safe. Wear your mask, wash your hands frequently, and get vaccinated as soon as you can.